Good evening and welcome to tonight's debate. The topic is that our grandparents' generation had it better when they were young than we do. On the affirmative team, we have Alex, Sierra and Inika, and on the negative team, Georgia, Emily and Declan. I now call upon Alex to begin this debate.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. The topic of tonight's debate is that our grandparents' generation had it better when they were young than we do. What we're going to define this as is our grandparents' generation was generally people who were born between the 1940s to the 1960s. So if you're born within that, we're going to generally include you within this. The criteria we have for being better for either generation are four things. One, personal, which is how the day-to-day experience for an individual within that was, how they would feel, what they would go through. Secondly, opportunities. We're looking at things like education and jobs, which is accessibility and how capable you were to actually, go particularly far within certain areas. Thirdly, we're looking at financial, that is your ownership of certain properties like land, like cars, but also the amount of income you would be able to have. And finally, we're looking at disasters, what things necessarily defined these generations as the worst things that could possibly happen there. 2 points tonight. Firstly, how the housing market was much better for our grandparents, and secondly, how the job market was similarly much better. Looking at the housing market, the things that define the current housing market necessarily are that it is incredibly expensive, and you generally will have to take out some form of loan that is probably going to last a majority of your working career, 20 to 35 years, where you are paying every single year to be able to try and have that dream of owning your own house. At the point in which our grandparents were able to buy houses with much better rates on land which previously was worth nothing, which these days can be worth millions of dollars, we thought it was generally easier for them to do so. The reason for this was simply because of the fact that less people owned land, particularly within Australia, it was a lot, it was built up a lot less, so it was a lot cheaper, in comparison, even accounting for things like inflation. The consequence of this meant that it was always easier for our grandparents to have something like their dream of owning your own house. We think the effect of this necessarily is twofold. One, this is a massive financial burden on you compared to your grandparents, being that necessarily even if you wanted to buy a house, you will be buying it from your grandparents' generation because they're the ones who own all the property. But secondly, we thought that this was a massive personal struggle, that every day you had to struggle with the fact that a large part of your salary was going towards trying to pay off this loan to be able to purchase a house. But you always thought the freedom you had where you could move wherever you want really, and you could after a few years and working hard, you could get a house. We always thought that was better. Secondly, talking about jobs. What defines jobs these days is necessarily jobs that are very repetitive and give you little satisfaction, which means that the individual gains very little personal enjoyment from it. But secondly, the fact that a lot of these jobs are very unstable. We see that low-skilled jobs are often being taken by automation because of the fact that they are so simple and repetitive to do. What this means is that people who get stuck in these low-skilled jobs end up in cycles where they continually have to take new low-skilled jobs, which slowly get taken up because they are never able to stay in the job long enough to gain the type of skills needed to reach for higher-paying jobs. But secondly, within this, people necessarily on higher-paying jobs where they had to go to university because we have, in effect, everyone is told that you must go to university and then you have to do a postgraduate degree to even be competitive. After you spend, 5 to 8 years of your life studying and suddenly that job is lost to automation, well, suddenly you have spent a ton of money there and you have a ton of skills which aren't applicable to anything else. This is because currently a majority of the money goes to that top 10 to 1% of people within the world, and everyone else starts to lose out. The consequence of this means that there's massive financial instability for a majority of citizens, but also they are incapable of feeling secure in their every day-to-day life. We think the fact that beyond this, that you have less control over your working hours, even ignoring all of this, and that you weren't able to generally go and start up your own business because a majority of different areas had monopolies, like Apple over the tech business, with Microsoft, and Like it was very hard to start up your own family business, meant that it was impossible for you to even dream of owning your own business, while many of our grandparents were able to start up their own businesses, become quite successful, and never had to worry about losing their jobs to a machine. For all of these reasons, we are so proud to propose.
I'd like to thank Alex for his speech and call upon Georgia to open the negative team's case.
Ladies and gentlemen, tonight, overcome by sentimentality and nostalgia, the affirmative team has tried to convince you that our grandparents' generation had it better than us. However, this has woefully mischaracterized a generation torn by war and depression, a generation ravaged by illness and disease. We, as the negative team, propose the following criteria to measure how good someone's life is. First of all, their access to healthcare and their healthiness in general. Secondly, their access to education. Thirdly, their ability to access equal opportunities. And finally, their access to entertainment and enjoyment. These are slightly different to what was proposed by the affirmative team, particularly in relation to the first two, except we believe they are highly essential to measuring how good someone's quality of life is. Before I go on with my case, I have identified two issues with the affirmative team's case. Firstly, on whether we have better housing now, and secondly, on jobs. So the first point of the affirmative was that our grandparents had better lives because they had better access to housing. We think what's first important to acknowledge is that whilst houses were often cheaper in the olden days, this did not mean that they were available to all. Particularly single women were unable to access the job market, access the housing market, possibly partially because of their lack of jobs, but also because of the social expectations in those days that women weren't able to buy their own homes. We also have to remember that when we're saying houses were cheaper, that also people were generally poorer, and where they were living were not comparable to where we would like to live today. For example, these were often 1 or 2 bedroom homes with 1 bathroom or an outhouse that are not comparable to today's home, even if in today's money they were slightly cheaper. The second point that the affirmative team raised was on jobs. And I think that the key thing here to acknowledge is that the jobs that they had in those days were far more unsafe than we have today. There was no Workplace Health and Safety Act. There was no one stepping out there to make sure that people weren't injured. And for that reason, we saw a large number of injuries at jobs. Equally, those jobs were more often to be jobs in factories and as labourers that were far less satisfying to those working there. Next, like I touched on when talking about women's access to housing, women also did not have the access to the same kinds of jobs. Instead, they were expected to be secretaries, teachers, or nurses, and if they did go and get an education at university, they were just seen to be there as looking for a husband. On the topic of university, which was brought up briefly, that it was free, this was true, except it was far less accessible to a generation where less people were educated to a high school level and very few made it to senior education or university because of the pressures to go out and get a job. Now onto my substantive. Tonight I have 2 points. Firstly, that our grandparents' generation was blighted by war and depression, and secondly, that we are fortunate in our access to healthcare. Now on to my first point on war and depression. Our grandparents were born in the shadow of the Second World War and the Great Depression. In Australia, meat rationing continued until 1948 and in Britain until 1954. Having grown up in this environment, many of our grandparents and their friends were then conscripted into the Korean War and Vietnam War, which left them with physical and mental scars. In contrast, our generation was lucky. Yes, we were born in the shadows of 9/11 and the War on Terror, but we have never had to be afraid of going to bed and not waking up because we were bombed. We've never had to go to bed wondering whether tomorrow we wouldn't have enough food for us and our 8 siblings. None of us has had to leave school at 12 to get a job to support our families. We've never had to wait in fear and anticipation, wondering whether our birth date will be pulled out and whether we will be conscripted to go to war. Now on to my second point on healthcare. Polio, the measles, TB, whooping cough, diphtheria. These are all serious diseases that killed or paralysed thousands of people when our grandparents were young. Now they are entirely or nearly completely eradicated thanks to the introduction of widespread vaccination. Whilst we do have new and dangerous diseases, these can be quickly combated by the advances of science that we've had since our grandparents' generation. Equally, more is now known about mental health. After the Vietnam War, people suffering from PTSD were largely disregarded and dismissed as having shell shock. Today, we were able to treat these mental illnesses far more effectively and with far more compassion and understanding. In conclusion, tonight I've given you 2 reasons why our grandparents' generation did not have it better than we do. They were, firstly, that our grandparents' generation was blighted by war and depression, and secondly, that we are fortunate in our access to healthcare. For these reasons, it is truly our generation that is the lucky ones.
I'd like to thank Georgia for her speech and call upon Sierra to continue the affirmative choose case.
Good evening. It was ridiculous for the negative team to say that in a world in which we constantly have to brace for the never-ending fear of climate change, that we are living in a better tangible position. Because we have to deal with the understanding that we might not have breathable air, we might not be able to live in our cities, and our oceans might consume us. Those are types of anxieties that were never dealt with before in the past, and that's why we necessarily have it worse in today's generation. I'm going to prove 2 things in this speech. First, why social media that exists today makes our society worse than our grandparents, and secondly, why the pressure of climate change that looms over us makes it harder for us to ever get out of this stress and this cycle of depression that exists now when you think about the future. Before that though, I'd like to point out a couple of flaws in the opposition's case. The first of which is when they tell us that housing and jobs, although they were cheaper in the past, were just less accessible. Firstly, I don't think that in the 1960s there were laws that explicitly prohibited women from being able to buy houses, but even to the extent that maybe those things did exist or there were barriers, we think that it was still better that people still had the ability to choose, even if they had to get into marriage, to be able to get an affordable house. That was because, first of all, it allowed you to have long-term wealth and to be able to grow your money and giving that house back to your children in the future generations. That was a huge way of gaining wealth that we just didn't have today. The anxiety of going from rental place to rental place was something that exists in our generation alone, and that is something that's really harmful. Next, what they tell us is that jobs that worked in our grandparents' generation, things like labourers that weren't really good jobs and they shouldn't have liked doing them anyway, we think that it's not really a fair thing for the opposition to say that some jobs are simply undesirable. A lot of people derive a lot of value from being able to do a hard days of labour, and they feel like they really contributed something to their community, even if that is hard work. A lot of those people now in today's society watch those same factories that their grandparents once worked in die and be replaced with automation and robots. That's an incredibly depressing experience to see that your quality of life, your way of life that you once appreciated, that it exists in your family, is now diminishing before your eyes. That is something that we currently have to deal with, and what we're going to do to derive value in the absence of jobs is absolutely unclear and something that we still have to contend with. Lastly, they tell us that wars existed back then, and that's why all of our things about health just don't really make sense. Firstly, we tell you that wars still happen today and people still suffer from PTSD, but the first thing that we want to say is that obviously there were other places in the world in which the wars in today's society still affect, right? So people in the Middle East or in other countries we actually go and do wars in, those people are still going to be affected by PTSD, and the fact that there are more of them today means that they have less access to the resources opposition cares about. The next thing they tell us is that now we have better research for PTSD. We know that first of all, because you have a limited amount of ability to do stuff with your social security money or your welfare money, it means you're not able to actually get an affordable living standard or a house or be able to afford things, because as a veteran who comes back from war, you have to deal with the hugely inflated housing prices, the inability to get a job in your town, which was once a mining town, or was once a factory, and you have to deal with all of those things whilst also dealing with your PTSD. That means it's a lot harder for those people to enter back into societies. Last on the issue of diseases, COVID still exists. We still have evidence that diseases can come today. Obviously, we might have better resources to be able to deal with them, but just generally, you don't take into account these stress-induced mental illnesses that exist from things like social media that I'll talk about later, but just generally from the cycle of poverty that we currently have to deal with in terms of not knowing if you're going to be able to get a stable job, if that's going to go away to automation. Firstly, on my substantive point about social media, why is social media making our generation's life worse? Firstly, because we don't have as many meaningful interactions with the people who really see us in real life. A lot of times when you go on social media, it's like looking at TikTokers and influencers, not actually building the connections with the people who can check on you in your hard times or who actually genuinely care about you. You lose those bonds and you become more isolated. Secondly, cyberbullying is something that is really harmful to today's generation. It makes kids feel isolated, and more importantly, the fact that we have cell phones on us all the time means that it's an inescapable form of bullying, unlike in our grandparents' generation. Thirdly, we just don't have the ability to have a more active lifestyle in our generation because we're always in front of our phones. Secondly, on the issue of climate change, and this is my second point, we tell you that in our grandparents' generation, they were able to abuse their natural resources, mine however much they wanted to, without ever having to contend with the future of a depleted planet that was unlivable. In our generation, we have to implement a lot of really difficult policies like green energy and transferring all of our jobs to the renewable sector, which costs a lot of money up front, and we have to pay for that, and that's really unjust. The second aspect of this, though, is the hugely emotionally exhausting burden that is placed on our shoulders. That is so unique for two specific reasons. Firstly, is because we know it only affects our generation. That is that there are a lot of different generations living today, but it is only us who will have to breathe in the unbreathable air that smells absolutely horrible and gives everyone asthma. It's only us who will have to live in cities that are deluged by oceans and never able to actually travel to other places or see other wildlife. That means you're essentially just alone in a minority trying to fix a problem that no one else will ever actually care about enough. And that is also coupled with the fact that everyone tells us that you're too young to do anything about it. At the end of this, I brought you two things: why social media was bad, but second, why climate change was a looming issue of our heads. We were so happy to be on the event.
I thank Sierra for her speech and call upon Emily to continue her team's case. Ladies and gentlemen, while it is undeniable that our generation do currently face many unique challenges, we are not the first generation to go through hardship, and the affirmative team has presented a highly idealised perspective on what it was like to suffer through being in our grandparents' generation. They had to face war, hunger, disease, without the kind of technology and the many advancements and the relative equality that we have achieved today, and that is why we will win this debate. So, before I continue with my team's substantive arguments, I would like to address two issues in the affirmative team's case. Firstly, on social media, and secondly, on the issue of climate change. So, first with the issue of social media. So, the opposition has told us that social media doesn't enable you to build genuine connections, and that there are huge issues with cyberbullying, and that it's a huge blight on the kind of physical health of our young people today. A few responses to this. So, firstly, we believe that bullying has always existed, and that while cyberbullying might, create different challenges for those being bullied, it is in some ways, not a huge extension of the problem that already existed. But importantly, for children who are feeling socially isolated, social media now provides them the opportunity to reach out and find like-minded people in their community to connect with in the same way they wouldn't have been able to do in our grandparents' generation, where if you were different from other kids and facing difficulties, you were very much alone in your community. Also, we think that it's got a huge potential for good, and that you can build genuine connections, as we'll establish in our substantive argument later. They also told us about that it's bad for children's active lifestyle. However, we tell you that children will always be finding excuses not to exercise if they want to. Before, phones, it might have been books, or it might have been other activities that they enjoy, and that social media is not to blame for this. And this is why we think that our grandparents' generation did not have it better than what you did when they were young. Now to my second rebuttal point about climate change. The opposition has told us this is a unique, really stressful situation that our grandparents' generation did not have to suffer through that makes their generation preferable. However, we have a few responses. So first, we think that every generation has had huge challenges that have faced them, and as my first speaker has elaborated on, there have been significant challenges that faced our grandparents' generation when they were young. However, we say that although climate change is a really, really big problem facing our society, it's been unfolding for a long time, and we've been feeling the negative effects for a long time. However, we're the first generation that genuinely is on the precipice of great change, that genuinely has technology to eradicate these threats and to engage in creating a better future for our children and our grandchildren. And that's why we think that although climate change can be very stressful, it's not a unique problem, that it's not uniquely problematic, and we think that there are lots of other aspects of being in our generation that are more positive, and that's why we think that our generation have it better. Now to my 2 points. Firstly, on social media and the opportunities that presents, and finally about the opportunities for women and marginalised groups in society. So in the first point about social media. So in our grandparents' generation, it was incredibly difficult to communicate because it was expensive,
It took a lot of time, and you could only talk to people you knew. So for example, if you wanted to send a letter to someone, it could take weeks and weeks, and they might not even deliver it at all. It could be really expensive to make a phone call. For our generation, communication is readily available. It's inexpensive, it's accessible to everyone, and it's instantaneous. That means that a lot of people, if you want to send a message to someone anywhere in the world, you can go to the public library and log on and access Facebook for free and send messages to people. Or you can call and make inexpensive calls to your loved ones and stay connected. I think this means that we have it better, our generation had it better when we were younger, because you're able to talk to more people and talk more often to them and talk whenever you need. So if you need to access a family member who's overseas, you can access them instantaneously for an emergency. In times like COVID has shown us that interconnectedness is more important than ever to combat social isolation and also to spread messages and learn more about the world around you. And that's why, and also to make friends more of the world. We think that we clearly have it better because we're the more connected generation. And as we see the old generation now are currently facing issues of isolation, it's very clear that our generation, which is connected by this amazing technology, have it better than our grandparents' generation. Now to my second point about women and marginalised groups in society. So for our grandparents' generation, women in many groups in society were unable to access an education. They couldn't work in many jobs. They weren't protected by laws, they were deprived healthcare, and they couldn't do things like buy a house without having someone to guarantor for it, which really limited their options in society. I think that, for example, many women were expected to drop out of school or didn't continue through to university. In our generation, women are highly educated and more women graduate university than men. There are many job opportunities, and it's much easier to have children and to have a decision to make, have a career because of things like paid parental leave. Similarly, for groups like Indigenous Australians in society, there's been huge advancements in access to education, and more importantly, people in our grandparents' generation that were Indigenous didn't even have the right to vote. So we think that's a huge advancement in society, and whilst there are undeniably changes that still need to be made, we think that there has been huge progress achieved that you can't ignore. Today I presented 2 points. Firstly, about the benefits of social media, and secondly, about the advancements for marginalised groups. And for that reason, we're very, very proud to oppose.
I'd like to thank Emily for her speech and call Annika to conclude the affirmative team's case.
Okay. So what the opposition has failed to consider in this debate is that it doesn't really matter if you can get a super safe job doing some kind of physical data entry that you don't enjoy if you are still $50,000 in debt from a university education that financially crippled you and you can't get that job in the first place because the job market is insane. That was something that hasn't been responded to yet, and we don't think just saying that safety measures have increased so now you're less likely to be injured at your job really covers for that, because I think individuals are much more likely to just want to have a source of income in the first place. Okay, so I'm going to talk about a few things in this speech in rebuttal. Firstly, I'm going to talk about jobs and housing, then I'm going to talk about health and the internet, and those things tie together because of social media. And then lastly, then I'm going to talk about some minority groups, and then lastly, I'm going to talk about war and disasters and climate change and stuff like that. So now on to my first point in terms of jobs. They say that there is, there is more pressure to get a job nowadays. That there are better jobs that you can get nowadays that don't involve manual labor and don't involve dropping out of school at the age of 13. We tell you that the comparative back in the comparative is in between these two jobs. The comparative is actually between that and being unemployed because the job market is so difficult. We don't think it's true to say that the jobs are inherently better just because they don't involve manual labor nowadays. We think most likely you're either in a job that you hate and you don't find satisfying, as well as being super in debt, or you're just unemployed as well as being incredibly in debt. We would much prefer that people either don't go to university and just go into manual labor jobs like our grandparents did, and that would be much better for them, or they would just go to uni and get a job straight out of uni. That was obviously much better than being unemployed. In terms of housing, this was something that kind of fell out of the debate, and we think this is still really, really important, that it's very important for people to buy a house if that's something that they think would bring them a lot of happiness. And we think that also women can usually do this, or could do this in our grandparents' generation. We think there are a lot of avenues for women to live independently, even if they would face some societal backlash for that. In terms of health, on to my next issue about health and the internet, which I think is a pretty large issue in this debate. The negative team starts by saying that we have vaccines for things like polio now. In response to that, we would say that there are still heaps of diseases that can kill people. There's stuff like COVID nowadays, which shows that these diseases will keep evolving in ways that we don't know how to respond to. There's also the obesity crisis and stuff like that, which is getting exponentially worse and is much worse nowadays than it was in our grandparents' generation. And then lastly, there's mental health, which I think is probably the biggest issue. The fact that things like the percentage of people who face mental health issues is increasing so much. They only responded to that by saying that people experience PTSD in our grandparents' generation, but there's absolutely nothing like the mental health crisis that we see nowadays, where so many more young people are facing mental health issues. And a lot of that ties into the internet. It is simply true that kids don't go outside and play on the streets after school anymore. They don't go outside and talk to their neighbours and stuff like that. They will just go onto their computers or go onto their phones. There's so much less of a sense of community in between neighbours and in between families and stuff like that, because you simply aren't spending time with your families anymore. Because kids these days will simply instead choose to hang out with people virtually, but they're not making the same kind of connections and they're not learning the same kind of skills that they would be in the older days, the old days, like the social skills and stuff that come from actually interacting with people face to face. That's something that is incredibly valuable, as well as the fact that cyberbullying is much more common nowadays, which is obviously worse. In terms of women, on to my next point about women and what they can do in society. Obviously, there was some more societal backlash that would happen from achieving an education in the 50s, but we think that women were still able to do that, and they also got to not go to war, which I think would have been pretty cool in World War II and in the Vietnam War and stuff like that. So there were some benefits, even if it was worse. But even if it was worse, we think that overall the rest of society was so much better that it was still worth it. And in terms of, so on to my final point about climate change. Living in the 1950s and the 1960s would have been possibly the only time where you could live and use all of the benefits of having like coal-powered fuel and stuff like that without worrying about climate change. And with that in mind, I think it would be an absolutely excellent time to live. And I think that our grandparents were incredibly lucky to experience that without having to worry about the constant climate change anxiety that the rest of us do nowadays. So for those reasons, we definitely think that our grandparents' generation had it better than ours.
I'd like to thank Inika for that speech and call upon Declan to conclude this debate.
In tonight's debate, we see an opposition team that is scarily willing to compare a non-imminent threat like climate change with the immediate threats of disease and bombings to people's literal daily lives. Before I conclude my team's case, I have three issues I'd like to go over. The first one is about individuals' day-to-day life, including health and stress, etc. The second one about opportunities to education and then jobs. And the third one is financial, about housing, etc., and about minorities and their access to housing. So firstly, on the issue of individuals, the difference in how people's health is monitored is far better now than what it was back when our grandparents were children. The advancement of vaccinations, etc., and ability just to get quick responses to even basic illnesses improves your day-to-day experience substantially. We had a lot of material in this debate about climate change and the stress that causes to children of the modern era. And we agree that there is some level of stress that comes along with that. But we also contest that there is a strong opportunity for improvement in people's mental health through the overcoming of this issue. We think that generations to come will enjoy more interesting technology, greener technology, which will eventually come around, hopefully, to counteract climate change. We also think that stress itself is dealt with far better these days than it was back when our grandparents were children. We think that just because there isn't necessarily a mental health crisis happening, we think that we're just better at diagnosing and treating people for these mental health issues that we see in the modern day. Yes, as well as connectivity, and we see all these positive elements of social media as well, which Emily spoke about. On that, we also heard a bit about like cyberbullying, etc. And we think that bullying definitely was still a thing back in the days of our grandparents. We thought that even back then teachers were just probably nowhere near as good at dealing with it. Things like corporal punishment existed, and kind of like a toughen up attitude, which is probably not good for kids' mental health back then compared with now. We're much more sensitive towards issues, especially between kids, etc. So secondly, on opportunities, firstly, we think that education is just better to begin with. Like before I even talk about access to education, the fact that the internet exists means that we can just take some study that was done in Norway and use it to corroborate some study done in America and come up with a new idea in Australia is incredibly interesting and far better for us than it was for them. And continuing on to jobs and job security, we see that the rise of unions and protection for workers, which we heard at Georgia, is far better now, as well as unemployment benefits are just substantially better now than what they were. People have access to healthcare, etc., without necessarily having to have a job and income. On the issue of education and access to education, we heard a lot about like uni putting you in a bunch of debt. We think that HECS, although not a perfect system, is like probably okay at dealing with people who do leave university and not straight away able to use their degree to get into the high-paying job that they thought that they were going to get. And we also clearly contest the idea that it was just like super easy to start a business. Back in the 60s, we believe that our grandparents also had to work quite hard to start and maintain businesses. They were subject to the market the same way people are now, and we don't think that it was just like substantially easier for them to just like have their life made for them just by starting some random business that people just came and bought stuff from for whatever reason. On the final issue of housing, and I also want to touch on minorities and their access to housing, etc. within this. We hear from the opposition that you could just buy a house like with pocket change back in the day, and these days you spend your entire life paying off a mortgage, and there's a large amount of stress from that. As was brought up by Georgia, we'd say that those only in positions of power with like substantial jobs were able to just buy a house off the cuff. And we think that women, most notably, as well as minorities, definitely didn't have as much access to this as like white men would have. We also thought that the Australian dream, is perhaps waning a little bit, and maybe that's like for the best, and that our generation will find alternative ways to get around having to just having issues with just buying houses straight off the cuff. We think that like renting also is better with like the RTA and other unions and stuff, so that people are able to rent and still have housing, etc. We thought that that was always better. To do with housing as well, if you were unfortunate enough to not be able to buy or rent a house, we think it's much better for you these days because unemployment benefits are better, social security is just generally better for those people going through those issues. Tonight my team has presented 4 points. At first speaker they were about war and depression and how it was much worse then than what the issues are that face us now on a global scale. The second was about how much better healthcare is now compared with back then. The second speaker, we talked about the benefits of social media and how good that is and how it wouldn't have been as good for them not to have it. And the final point was about how much better it is for women